Hi everybody. I wanted to talk just a little bit about history and actually the idea of history. The fact is, we are currently living in history. We are living through history. We are living through a time in history which will be remembered not just for a few years, but for many decades and very probably for at least a few centuries. We are actually part of history. And this is something which I think we need to be aware of, and we need to consider our own time. Because this pandemic, and the reason I'm talking to you on a camera rather than face-to-face, is itself a historical moment. And I think we should take just a moment as historians, and we are all historians in this class, and think about this and appreciate this. And so when we think about how history unfolds, we have to consider a number of things. Number one is the question of how does history work? And of course, we talked at the very beginning of the semester about what we call great man theories of history. And the idea in great man theories of history is the notion that somebody like, say, Donald Trump or Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great single-handedly makes history happen. History is the result of these great men. And yes, it's horribly sexist because, of course, it's always about these men. And it's interesting, the great man theory of history always seems to focus on men who are politically powerful. And so when people talk about what's going on in the world today, they talk about what is Donald Trump doing, or what is the Premier of China doing, or what is Vladimir Putin doing in Russia, these individuals, as if they're the only ones who actually make a difference. And in fact, that's just not true. Only rarely in human history does one person make that kind of difference. We've already met Alexander the Great, and Alexander the Great, of course, is a case of one person who really did personally change history, but he is rare in the extreme. People like him happen only once every several millennia, usually. So this is something to keep in mind. So when we think about how history is working out, it's interesting to look at the people who are making decisions now, and we are all hoping that Donald Trump and others make wise decisions in this time of great crisis, because nobody wants things to get any worse. Nobody wants to have this pandemic get any worse. But who's really running the show? Who is the individual, or what is making history happen? It's not Donald Trump. He won't like it if I say that, but it's not Donald Trump. It's not the Premier of China. It's not Vladimir Putin. Every one of those people is reacting. And the only actor which is actually making things happen is this infinitesimally small virus which has managed to explode all over the world and which is keeping us at home. And I hope all of you are home and safe and all of that. So this is an important thing for us to think about here. What Donald Trump and the Premier of China and Vladimir Putin and all these other political leaders are doing is reacting to the virus. They don't control it. And I think that probably makes them unhappy. These are not people who like to be out of control. When you become that politically powerful, you're often something of a control freak. And so what we're seeing now is the world seems out of control to these folks, and that's because it really is. But in fact, the world is always a little bit out of control. Nobody has total control of the world. That's just the way it is. And so for all of us who are now sitting at home, hopefully safe, we are dealing with a world where we're being reminded we don't have the kind of control which even a few months ago we thought that we did. And so this is a very important thing to think about. There's something else I want you to think about as well. You and I right now are living through a historically important time. And all of you know that, of course, what we know about the past and what we know about history comes from sources. Primary sources, of course, are sources from the time of the actual event themselves. And so the actual events of history that we've discussed in this class come to us from primary sources, at least hopefully. There are also secondary sources. Now, secondary sources, of course, are sources written about primary sources. They use primary sources as their source of information, and they tell us sometimes centuries later what people thought about the events depicted in the primary sources. And then, of course, there's what we call tertiary sources. Those tend to be things like textbooks, which take secondary sources and distill them into a manageable level of understanding. So, here's the thing. Right now, all around us, We are watching history unfold. This pandemic is a major event in world history. It will be remembered for a very long time. And you and I and all of us are living through it, which means that you and I and all of us are primary sources. So here's what I'd like you to do if you feel like it. It's not required, it's not part of the class, but I'd like you to think about keeping a journal. Start writing down every day what you thought about today, what you experienced, what you saw, how did the news impact you and those immediately around you. Now this is very private. You don't ever have to share this with anybody. All right, this is something that is entirely for you, but it is a primary source. And someday, when you are an old curmudgeon like me, you might come back and look at your journal and look at what you said during the middle of this major historical event, and you may say, that's interesting. And maybe you'll share that with your kids, your grandchildren, and maybe some historian will come along someday and say, wow, this is a source of information, and this is valuable not just to me, but to the world, because you can't go back in time. We will not be able to relive these moments. And so if you record what you're feeling and experiencing during this time, you will have a record of something absolutely major, something that is going to totally change the world. I don't know how the world is going to change. Remember, the worst possible people to ask how the future is going to turn out are historians. We're very good at looking at what happened in the past and try to figure out why. We are not any good at predicting things. Our friend Karl Marx tried, and we all saw how that turned out. We don't know how our social systems, our political systems, our economic systems that are in place today are going to have to adapt, are going to have to change, are going to be altered by this event. We have no idea, and the people who are trying to predict the future right now, well, most of them are probably not going to get it right. We have to wait and see. So what I think you should do is start, for your own interest, for your own sake, is keeping a record of your life right now in this major historical event. I'm keeping a journal of this stuff, and I think it will be very interesting for my descendants to have a look at it in a few hundred years. They will also probably wonder why I often wear funny hats, but it will be very interesting. So that's what I encourage you all to do, and what I'm going to do now is turn off this little recording, and then I'm going to start making lectures for all of the classes and get them posted, and then, as my old professor at Yale used to say, happiness will follow. That at least is our goal, and I hope you are all safe and well, and I will hope to see you all as soon as we get past this hump in history. So hopefully we will all be okay. Take care.